The gavel came down hard, $60. Laughter broke across the auction yard like a wave sharp, the kind that doesn't bother hiding itself. Every eye in that dusty lot turned toward David Coles, a black single father in worn work boots who had just spent his last $60 on a rusted metal box welded shut with the ugliest bead of steel anyone in that crowd had ever seen. Men nudged each other. Someone said something low and cruel. Buck Mallory laughed the loudest. That evening, David carried the box home, and when his cutting torch finally burned through that weld, the whole town would never be the same again. The estate sale of Elias Ward had drawn maybe 40 people to the edge of town that Saturday morning, not because anyone particularly mourned the old machinist, but because death has a way of turning a man's life into a bargain. Folding tables stretched across the gravel lot outside the Ward property, loaded with socket sets, drill bits, lathe components, and decades of carefully kept tools that nobody in Harlan Creek had ever been allowed to touch while Elias was alive. A county auctioneer in a straw hat worked the crowd from a wooden platform, and the bids came easy men in clean boots, raising their paddles for belt grinders and hydraulic jacks, the kind of equipment that held real resale value. David Coles stood near the back. He had driven 40 minutes in a truck that needed new brake pads with his 9-year-old son Marcus, sitting quiet beside him eating a biscuit from a paper bag. David was 34 broad through the shoulders, the kind of man whose hands told his whole story. Before he ever opened his mouth, knuckles thickened from years of welding work, a faint burn scar running along his left forearm where a slag splatter had caught him years ago on a job site outside Abilene. He'd been working contract jobs since the steel yard laid him off the previous winter, picking up whatever came through: exhaust repairs, gate fabrication, trailer hitches. Enough to keep the lights on. Most months. He hadn't planned to bid on anything. He was there because Marcus had asked to come, had heard about the estate sale from a kid at school, and wanted to see what a real machinist's shop looked like up close. David figured he'd let the boy look around, maybe pick up a small tool for a couple dollars and head home before noon. Then the auctioneer brought out the box. It came on a flatbed cart pushed by a teenage helper who looked mildly embarrassed by it. The thing was roughly the size of a large toolbox, maybe 24 inches long, 12 wide, made of quarter-inch steel plate that had gone the color of dried blood from rust. Every seam had been welded shut, not tacked, not spot-welded, fully sealed bead by bead all the way around with the kind of deliberate layered passes a skilled hand lays down when he means for something to stay closed. The crowd's reaction was immediate and uniform. People turned away. Someone near the front made a joke about a coffin for squirrels. Buck Mallory, who had planted himself center-left with the easy authority of a man accustomed to taking up space, looked at the box the way a person looks at something they've already decided is worthless. Buck ran the largest salvage yard in 3 counties. He was loud in the way that money makes certain men loud, filling every silence with his own voice before anyone else could. He'd already bought 4 lots that morning, including Elias Ward's industrial band saw, which he'd gotten for less than half what it was worth because nobody else in the crowd had the yard space for it. The auctioneer started the bidding at $20. No one moved. He dropped it to $10. Still nothing. David looked at the box. He looked at the welds. Most people saw rust and a sealed lid and stopped there. David saw something else. The bead was consistent, not the erratic work of someone in a hurry or a rage, but smooth, controlled, laid down with patience. Whoever had sealed that box had done it the way David himself worked when he wanted a joint to hold forever. There was intention in it. A purpose. He raised his hand. The bid went to 20, then to 30, when the auctioneer, surprised by any movement at all, pushed the crowd for more. Buck Mallory, more out of reflex than interest, called out 40. David went to 50. Buck laughed and said 60 just to make a point. David said 60. The gavel came down. The laughter that followed wasn't polite. Buck turned to the men beside him and said something that didn't need to be said loudly to be heard. The words broke and charity case floated over clearly enough. A few people looked at David the way people look at someone who has just done something embarrassing in public with a kind of second-hand discomfort that tips quickly into contempt. David did not look back at them. He handed over 3 20s from an envelope in his shirt pocket, the last of the cash he'd been keeping for groceries, and waited while the teenage helper wrote out a receipt. Marcus had gone quiet. He stood at his father's elbow holding the paper bag, watching the men who were still laughing. While they waited for the cart to be brought around, David noticed a woman standing alone near the far edge of the lot, almost behind the last folding table. She was slight-dressed in dark clothes, too warm for the weather, and she wasn't looking at the crowd or the auctioneer. She was looking at the box. Her face was the stillest thing in that whole yard, not the stillness of indifference, but of someone holding something in very carefully the way a person holds their breath when they are trying not to cry in public. She was gone before David could wonder much more about her. One moment she was there, the next time he glanced over, the spot behind the table was empty. He and Marcus loaded the box into the truck bed together, one on each side, walking it over the tailgate. It was heavier than it looked. The steel alone accounted for some of it, but there was weight inside, too distributed, not rolling loose, the kind of weight that sits settled. On the drive home, Marcus asked, "What do you think is in it?" David kept his eyes on the road. "Don't know yet." "Then why'd you buy it?" He thought about that for a moment, about the weld, about the patience it had taken to lay that bead, about the fact that a man like Elias Ward, who by every account had spent 40 years building things, meant to last, would not have sealed a box that carefully unless what was inside was worth sealing. Because, David said, sometimes the thing nobody wants is the thing somebody worked hardest to protect. Marcus looked out the window and didn't say anything else. They rode the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet that exists between people who don't need to fill every mile with words. The truck rattled over the county road brake pads, grinding faintly on the curves. In the rearview mirror, David could see the box sitting in the truck bed, dark and still against the pale afternoon sky. He didn't know what was inside. But he knew one thing with the certainty that comes from 20 years of reading metal, that weld had been put there by someone who was trying to make sure the right person, and only the right person, would ever get to it. The loudest people in that auction yard saw $60 worth of rust. David saw a lock. The difference wasn't luck, it was the way a man learns to look at things after years of being told his judgment doesn't count. Most of us walk past locked things every day. People, places, ideas, and decide they're not worth the effort because they don't look like much on the outside. David didn't have that habit, and that one difference changed everything that came after. The talk started by Sunday. It moved the way talk always moves in a town like Harlan Creek, not announced just suddenly everywhere the way a smell gets into a house without anyone opening a window. David heard pieces of it through the week. A woman at the hardware store who went quiet when he walked in. His neighbor Gene, who usually waved from his porch, finding something important to look at in his yard instead. Marcus coming home from school on Tuesday with mud on his jacket and a look on his face that said the mud wasn't the worst part of his day. That evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table doing homework while David cooked. Neither of them brought up school. David set a plate in front of his son, sat across from him, and watched the boy eat with the careful stillness of a child who has decided not to say something. "You want to talk about it?" David asked. Marcus shook his head. David nodded and let it go. He understood the particular dignity of choosing silence. He'd been practicing it his whole life. The landlord called Thursday morning about the back rent. The man was not unkind about it, which almost made it worse. David told him he'd have something by the end of the month and got off the phone before the conversation could become a negotiation he didn't have the cards for. $60, a week's groceries, gone into a box that was still sitting in the corner of the garage under a canvas tarp, waiting. He wasn't ready to open it yet. He wasn't sure why some instinct that said the thing deserved to be approached, right, not cracked open out of desperation on a Tuesday night when the bills were piling up. So it sat there, and he worked, and he waited for something in him to settle enough to feel ready. The following Wednesday, David drove across town to pick up materials from a supplier near the old industrial district. He took a different route back. cutting through the block behind the Ward property. Mostly out of habit, he'd done contract work in that neighborhood 2 summers before, and the shortcut had stuck. He almost didn't see her. The woman from the auction was sitting on the front steps of a narrow clapboard house directly across from the Ward property's padlocked gate. She was holding a folded piece of paper in both hands, not reading it, just holding it the way a person holds something they've already memorized. Her eyes were on the gate, the rusted chain looped through the handles the county notice stapled to the post beside it. David slowed without meaning to. An older man was trimming a hedge 2 houses down, and when he noticed David's truck idling, he walked over to the curb. His name was Gerald, the kind of man who had lived on the same block for 40 years and knew everything about it without ever seeming to pry. "That's Ruth Ward," Gerald said, nodding toward the woman. "Elias's daughter. She drove up from Odessa after he passed, thought she'd at least get the house." He tucked his trimming shears under his arm. "Mallory family got to it first. Said Elias signed over the deed 2 years before he died. Ruth says that's not right, but she can't afford a lawyer to say so in court, so." He shrugged the shrug of a man who has watched too many things be not right without consequence. David looked at Ruth again. She hadn't moved. She was still watching that gate, the way a person watches something that belongs to them, but that they can no longer reach. He drove home. That night after Marcus was asleep, David went to the garage. He pulled the tarp off the box and set it on his workbench under the fluorescent light. He looked at it for a long moment, the rust-dark steel, the careful weld running all the way around each seam, the weight of whatever was settled inside. Then he pulled on his welding gloves, fitted his cutting goggles, and lit the torch. The blue flame touched the first weld joint, and the metal began to give. He worked slowly, methodically, the way he did everything, not fast, but right. The torch moved along the seam with the same patience that had originally put the bead there, as if he were having a conversation with whoever had done the welding, answering in the same language. The garage, filled with the familiar smell of hot steel and flux and sparks, fell in small, quiet arcs onto the concrete floor. It took the better part of an hour. When the last seam gave way, David set the torch down and let the metal cool before he touched it. Then he worked a pry bar gently under the lid, and the box opened. There was no gold, no jewelry, no stack of stock certificates. What was inside had been wrapped individually in oilcloth and then placed inside a waterproof canvas bag, the kind of careful, deliberate packing a man does when he wants something to survive him. David unwrapped the first piece. It was a document. A contract, original pages notarized, dated 11 years back. He read it slowly, then read it again. It was a property transfer agreement for the Ward machine shop and the surrounding lot. But the signatures on the transfer didn't match one of them on the line, for the seller bore a notary stamp from a county where Elias Ward had never lived, and the witness signatures were the same hand written twice with different names. David set it down and unwrapped the second piece. A canvas pouch thick. He loosened the drawstring. Inside was cash banded, organized, the kind of money a man saves deliberately over years, not in a single lump, but bill by bill, the way people save when they know they can't trust banks or lawyers or systems that have never worked in their favor. David didn't count it. He could see it was substantial, more than he'd seen in one place in a long time. He set the pouch aside and reached for the third item, an envelope sealed with 2 words written on the front in the careful block letters of a man more comfortable with steel than with pen. "For you." David opened it. The letter was 3 pages handwritten. Elias Ward's hand was steady at the start, and looser by the 3rd page, the way handwriting goes when a person is writing something they know will be the last thing they write. He explained the money, decades of savings, meant for Ruth, kept in cash, because he no longer trusted the accounts after the first set of legal papers showed up. He explained the contract, how it had appeared after a meeting with Buck Mallory's father, how he had never signed it, how he had recognized what was happening and had no way to prove it. He described sealing the box. He described leaving it in the auction inventory on purpose, because he knew the Mallorys would never bid on something that looked like junk, and because he believed the letter said this plainly without sentiment, that the person who opened it would be someone who knew how to look past the surface of a thing. The last paragraph read, I don't know who you are, but you were patient enough to see what others didn't and decent enough to open this the right way. Whatever you find here belongs to my daughter Ruth. Her whole life was supposed to come from this shop. I'm sorry I couldn't protect it better while I was alive. I'm trusting you to carry it the rest of the way." David read that paragraph twice. He sat on the stool at his workbench for a long time, the letter in his hands, the cash pouch beside him, the forged contract laid flat under the fluorescent light. The garage was quiet, except for the tick of the cooling steel. What Elias Ward built wasn't just a box, it was a filter. He understood that greed moves fast and patience moves slow, and he designed accordingly. A man like Buck Mallory would look at rusted steel and see nothing worth his time. A man like David would look at the same steel and ask why someone had taken such care closing it. The box didn't choose David by accident. Elias had spent a lifetime reading people through the work they left behind, and he built a lock that only a certain kind of character could open. Not the smartest man in the room, not the richest. The one who still believed that careful work meant something. The money was enough. He knew that, without counting it. Enough to clear the back rent and the brake pads and the school fees Marcus hadn't mentioned, but that David had seen in the folder on the counter. Enough to get ahead of things maybe for the first time in years. If he said nothing, put the cash somewhere quiet, burned the letter, kept the contract to himself, there was no trail. No one knew what was in the box. The auctioneer hadn't known. Buck Mallory certainly hadn't known, or he never would have let it go for $60. David looked at the last line of the letter again. "I'm trusting you to carry it the rest of the way." He thought about Ruth sitting on those steps holding that piece of paper watching a gate that led to something that should have been hers. He thought about Marcus asleep in the next room, at an age where he was watching everything his father did and filing it away in the part of a child's mind that becomes character. David folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and began repacking the oilcloth. There's a version of this story where David keeps the money and no one ever knows. That version exists. It's even understandable. But the thing about Elias Ward is that he didn't seal that box for just anyone. He sealed it for someone specific, someone he couldn't name, but somehow knew. And David, sitting alone in that garage at midnight, understood that being trusted by a dead man is one of the heaviest things a living one can carry. Some choices don't come with guarantees or rewards. David had no way of knowing what would happen next. He knew only that a man had spent his last years building something that required a certain kind of person to find, and walking away from, that felt like breaking something he hadn't known he was responsible for keeping whole. David drove to Ruth's house the next morning. He brought the canvas bag, the oilcloth-wrapped contract, and the letter. He left the box itself in the garage. It had done its job. Marcus was at school. The truck's brakes ground softly on the turn onto her street, and David made a note in the back of his mind to fix them as soon as he had the money, which he understood as of last night he was not going to have any time soon. Ruth answered the door before he knocked. She must have heard the truck. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they recognize but can't place, searching his face for context. Then her eyes dropped to the canvas bag in his hands, and something shifted in her expression. Not hope, exactly. Something more careful than hope. The kind of look a person gets when they've been disappointed so many times that they've learned to keep the door almost closed just in case. "You were at the auction," she said. "Yes, ma'am," David said. "I bought the box." Ruth stood aside and let him in. The house was small and sparsely furnished, a folding table, 2 chairs, a cot, visible through the bedroom doorway. She had been living out of a single large duffel bag propped against the wall. This was not a woman who had settled in. This was a woman who hadn't yet decided whether staying was worth it. David laid everything out on the folding table. He explained what he'd found in order, without embellishment, the contract first, then the money, then the letter. He put the letter in front of her last and stepped back to give her room. Ruth read it standing up. She read it the way her father had written it, slowly, without rushing the hard parts. When she finished the 3rd page, she set it down flat on the table with both hands and looked at the wall for a long moment. "He never told me," she said finally. "I knew something was wrong with the transfer documents, but I didn't know he'd—" She stopped. started again. "He was protecting me. He didn't want me fighting a battle he thought I couldn't win while he was still alive." "The contract has a notary stamp from the wrong county," David said, "and the witness signatures are the same handwriting." Ruth looked at him. "Can you prove that?" "I'm a welder, not a lawyer, but somebody with the right credentials could." He nodded at the documents. "The originals are right there." The word got out faster than either of them expected. David never learned exactly who talked a neighbor who saw his truck, someone who recognized the canvas bag, or simply the particular cruelty of small towns where secrets have short lifespans. By Friday, Buck Mallory knew that David Coles had delivered something from the Ward estate to Ruth Ward, and by Saturday morning, a man in a gray suit was standing on David's porch. The man introduced himself as an attorney representing the Mallory family interests. He was polite in the way that expensive lawyers are polite smooth on the surface, with something entirely different underneath. He had a leather folder under his arm and a specific kind of smile that David had seen before on people who assumed the person across from them had a price. "Mr. Coles." The attorney said, "My clients understand there may have been some documents found in the estate property you purchased. They'd like to resolve this quickly and quietly out of respect for everyone involved." He opened the folder and produced a check. "This would cover any inconvenience." David looked at the check without touching it. The number had several digits. From inside the house came the sound of Marcus moving around in the kitchen, the clatter of a cereal bowl being set in the sink. "The documents belong to Ruth Ward," David said. "They're already with her." The attorney's smile held, but went thinner. "Mr. Coles, what you may not fully appreciate is that removing items from auction property and transferring them to a third party raises certain legal questions. My clients are prepared to be understanding about that. Given the circumstances provided, this matter is put to rest." "I paid $60 for that box at a county-licensed auction," David said. "Everything in it came with the purchase. You're welcome to take that up with the auctioneer." The attorney left. The check went with him unsigned. By the following Tuesday, the contract yard where David had been picking up supplemental welding work called to say his services were no longer needed. The supervisor sounded uncomfortable delivering the news and didn't offer a reason. He didn't need to. David thanked him and hung up. The next 2 weeks were the tightest they'd been in a long time. David stretched what was in the pantry, took Marcus off the school lunch program temporarily, and packed food from home instead and called the landlord to ask for another 2 weeks on the back rent. He kept the lights on by finishing a small gate repair job he'd already been paid a deposit on. He didn't tell Marcus what was happening with the Mallorys. The boy was 9 and some weights aren't sized for 9-year-olds. At night, after Marcus was asleep, David sat at the kitchen table and did the math on things, not just money, but the other kind of accounting a man does alone in the dark. He turned the situation over and looked at it from every angle the way he looked at a joint, before he welded it, checking for gaps, for weaknesses, for the place where a thing might fail under pressure. He kept coming back to the same conclusion. He had done the right thing. That didn't make it comfortable. It just made it true. This town had a way of making people feel like the rules only bent one direction. The Mallorys had operated that way for 2 generations, long enough that most people had stopped questioning it and started working around it instead. But there's a particular quality to men like Buck Mallory that they never quite account for. They are very good at winning games that everyone agrees to play. They have no practice with someone who simply refuses to pick up the cards. Ruth, it turned out, had more resources than her 2 chairs and a duffel bag suggested. A cousin in Dallas had once worked alongside a legal aid attorney named Patricia Sims, a woman who had spent the better part of a decade taking on property fraud cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable. Ruth made the call. Patricia reviewed the documents David had recovered and called Ruth back the same evening. "The notary stamp is fraudulent," Patricia said. "I can prove it in about 48 hours with a records request. The witness signatures are even sloppier. Someone got lazy." She was quiet for a moment on the line. "Where did your father find the man who opened that box?" "He didn't," Ruth said. "He just left a door that only the right person could open. Patricia filed for an emergency injunction the following week, which froze any further transfer of the Ward property while the signature authenticity was under review. The Mallory family's attorney filed a counter-motion. The counter-motion was denied. A regional newspaper in the next county over a small operation run by a woman named Sandra Greer, who had been covering Harlan Creek's civic affairs for 20 years, got hold of the story through a source at the county clerk's office and ran a piece that focused on the forged notary stamp in the sealed box. The headline was restrained. The details were not. Within 10 days of publication, 2 other former Mallory business partners came forward with separate complaints about document irregularities that they had previously considered not worth pursuing alone. The district attorney's office opened a preliminary inquiry. Buck Mallory's attorney stopped filing motions and started negotiating. The settlement took 3 weeks to finalize. In exchange for the district attorney's office agreeing not to pursue criminal charges, the Mallory family agreed to vacate all claims to the Ward property, return title to Ruth in full, and pay a sum that covered her legal fees and the years of lost income from the shop's closure. Buck Mallory did not appear in public for some time after the agreement was signed. His salvage yard went up for sale within the month. By the following spring, the Mallory name had gone quiet in Harlan Creek, in the way that certain names go quiet, not forgotten, but no longer said with the weight it used to carry. The Ward machine shop reopened on a Thursday in late March, a day so clear and cold that the sky looked like washed glass. Ruth had spent 2 months cleaning and rewiring the space herself, with help from a few people in town who showed up without being asked. A handmade sign above the front door read, "Ward and Company," in plain block letters her father's lettering copied from an old photograph. She called David the morning of the reopening. He drove over with Marcus after school. The shop smelled of fresh oil and metal, the good kind of smell, a working smell, not a memorial one. Ruth showed Marcus the lathe that had been her father's first major purchase, told him how it worked, let him press the power button. The boy stood and watched the chuck spin with the complete attention that children give to things they've decided are important. Ruth tried to give David an envelope before he left. He looked at it, then at her, and shook his head. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I want to." "Put it back into the shop," David said. "Your father built that place for you. Make it what he had in mind." Ruth kept the envelope in her hand for a moment. Then she nodded and put it in her jacket pocket. On the drive home, Marcus was quiet in the passenger seat, the same kind of quiet he'd had on the drive home from the auction months earlier. But it was a different quality of quiet. That day it had been the quiet of a child processing something confusing. This one was the quiet of a child who has understood something and is sitting with it carefully, the way you carry a full glass. After a while, Marcus asked, "Did we get anything?" David kept his eyes on the road. "We got the same thing we went in with." The boy thought about that. "That doesn't sound like winning." "Depends on what you're trying to keep," David said. That evening after dinner, Marcus dragged his old bicycle into the backyard and flipped it upside down on the grass. He'd been trying to fix a slipping chain for weeks. David watched from the back step as the boy sorted through the small toolkit, their toolkit, the one David had built piece by piece over the years, pulling out what he needed, setting the rest aside, working the problem in the patient and methodical way that he had apparently been watching long enough to absorb. The chain seated on the 3rd try. Marcus stood the bike up and tested the pedal. It held. He looked up at his father. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. David sat on the back step and watched his son ride slow circles in the fading light, and he thought about an old machinist who had spent his last years building a lock that the wrong people would never think twice about because the wrong people never do, and waiting for someone who would know what they were looking at. The auction crowd had laughed for about 30 seconds. What David built from that $60 took the rest of the year to finish. There's nothing remarkable about that math except that most people never do it because they're too busy listening to the 30 seconds. The hardest thing isn't doing the right thing when it's easy. It's doing it when nobody's watching, when there's no reward coming, and when the cost is real. David knew that, and one day, without needing to be told, Marcus would know it too.